Welcome back to English Podcast Go. I'm Cyrus, and each episode brings you closer to confident English. Let's jump into today's episode.
You see it everywhere, don't you? At celebrations, winding down after work, catching up with friends.
Yeah.
Alcohol is just, well, it's part of the landscape for so many of us.
Yeah.
We reach for it to relax, to socialize, maybe sometimes just habit.
It really is ubiquitous. But, behind that familiar glass, there's this incredibly complex, fascinating, and often pretty surprising scientific story unfolding inside your brain and body, really, with every single sip.
And that's exactly where we're heading today. We've done a real deep dive into a lot of scientific findings to understand precisely what alcohol, specifically ethanol, is doing.
Right.
From the moment it hits your system, through those immediate feelings, and crucially, into the longer-term changes it can bring about.
And our goal here is, well, it's pretty clear. We want to guide you through the science, uncover some of those maybe hidden impacts, and basically equip you with the information so you can make your own choices about drinking. Absolutely no judgment, just clarity.
Okay, let's get started then, right at the beginning. What is alcohol, chemically speaking? And why does it seem to spread so easily once it's inside you?
Okay, so the alcohol we drink is ethanol. That's the specific type. But, and this is really fundamental, it's still toxic. Inherently.
Right. Toxic. That's key.
Absolutely central to everything. And a big part of its widespread effect is down to its unique chemistry. Ethanol is soluble in both water and fat.
Okay. Why does that matter for you, the listener?
Well, think about most things your body deals with. They often need specific, molecular keys receptors to get into cells.
Right, like a lock and key.
Exactly. But alcohol, because it dissolves in water-based stuff and fatty cell membranes, it kind of doesn't need those keys. It can just pass directly, easily into pretty much all your cells and tissues.
Wow. So easy access everywhere.
That's it. And that easy access is why its effects are so incredibly broad and why it can cause damage basically throughout your system.
Okay, so it's in. What happens next? The liver gets involved, right?
Yeah, primarily, yes. The liver handles most of it, and it goes through this metabolic process. First step. Ethanol gets converted into something called acetaldehyde.
Acetaldehyde. And the science, well, it's pretty blunt about this stuff, isn't it?
It is. It's described basically as a potent poison, something that can, quote, damage and kill cells indiscriminately.
Yolks, indiscriminately.
Yeah. And this first conversion step, it uses up these crucial molecules called NAD. It's an intense process, meaning your liver cells, where this mainly happens. They really take a beating, as the source material puts it.
Okay, taking a beating. But that's not the end of the line, is it?
No, the process isn't done. Your body then takes that toxic acetaldehyde and converts it into acetate.
Acetate.
The second step also uses that NAD pathway, but acetate, that's actually something your body can use. It's a form of fuel.
So hang on, this is kind of wild. Your body takes a poison, ethanol, turns it into an even worse poison, acetaldehyde.
Right, as an intermediate.
Before it finally makes something usable, like acetate.
That's the process. A bit unsettling, maybe, but that's the biochemical pathway.
Okay, and this acetate, this explains the whole empty calories thing with alcohol.
It does, yeah. Because while acetate is energy, getting from ethanol to acetate is metabolically very expensive for your cells.
Yeah.
Especially using up all that NAD.
Plus, the acetate itself, it doesn't bring anything else to the table, right?
Exactly. Zero vitamins, no amino acids, no essential fatty acids, nothing nutritive. And honestly, as a fuel, acetate is actually a poorer source than something like sugar.
Got it. Okay, so that's the chemical journey. What about the feeling? Being drunk, tipsy, inebriated, what's actually happening?
Well, what's fascinating is how the science frames this feeling. It's described as a poison-induced disruption in how your brain's neural circuits are meant to function.
A disruption caused by that poison.
Acetaldehyde.
Primarily, yes. That acetaldehyde reaches the brain. Remember how easily ethanol and its metabolites cross membranes?
Right, because it's fat and water soluble.
Exactly. So it gets past the blood-brain barrier pretty easily. Okay, so it's in the brain. Where does it hit first? What areas?
A key initial target seems to be the prefrontal cortex, the PFC.
The executive control center. Thinking, planning.
And crucially, putting the brakes on impulsive behavior, that top-down inhibition, using neurotransmitters like GABA.
Okay, so if alcohol suppresses those brakes.
Then you start seeing those classic behavioral changes we associate with being drunk.
Like what?
Well, the science points to things like talking louder without realizing it. You know that feeling. You're at a party, step outside, and suddenly think, wow, was I shouting?
Yeah, definitely know that one.
Or maybe gesturing more spontaneous movement, like dancing.
Or just saying things.
Yeah.
Maybe things you wouldn't normally say, without much filter.
Precisely. Those brain areas involved in flexible thinking, the parts that help you weigh options or consider tact, they seem to kind of shut down somewhat, so people just say or do what pops into their head.
And this disruption, it also explains the memory thing. Blackouts.
Yes, absolutely. Alcohol strongly suppresses the neural networks in the hippocampus. That's the key region for forming and storing new memories.
Right.
And it's important to get this. A blackout doesn't necessarily mean someone's passed out, unconscious.
Yeah.
No. They can be wide awake, functional, even walking, talking, maybe even driving, frighteningly.
Wow.
But because the hippocampus is essentially offline, thanks to the alcohol, the brain just isn't recording those events.
Yeah.
Later on, there's simply no memory trace of that time.
Yes, gone. Okay, that's the immediate stuff. But here's where it gets maybe even more eye-opening for people. The long-term impacts. Changes that can happen even when you're not drinking.
Yeah, this is crucial. And first, we need to sort of redefine what chronic drinking means in this context. It's not just about heavy daily drinking.
Right, people might think, oh, that's not me.
Exactly. But the science shows these chronic patterns can include things like just having, say, 1 or 2 drinks most nights.
Okay.
Or maybe only drinking on weekends, but having, 3 or 4 on Friday, a few more on Saturday.
Right, or even just like 3 or 4 drinks, but only once a while.
Even that, yes. These regular patterns count as chronic exposure in these studies.
And the big, perhaps surprising finding here is
that these regular patterns, even if they seem moderate, physically change the circuits in your brain controlling habits and impulses.
Change them how?
They actually make you more habitual and more impulsive, even when you are completely sober.
Wow. Okay, unpack that. What's physically changing?
So the science describes an actual increase in synapses, those connections between neurons in the circuits that drive habit execution.
Okay, the go system gets stronger.
Kind of, yeah. And at the same time, there's a reduction in connections in the circuits needed for more deliberate, thoughtful behavior, the stop system.
So the brake gets weaker long term.
Exactly.
Yes.
That conscious control over impulses is weakened.
Is that permanent?
The good news is often not. For many people, abstinence, stopping drinking for, say, 2 to 6 months, allows those circuits to largely return to normal.
That's hopeful.
It is. Although very heavy, very long-term chronic use, that can potentially lead to more lasting changes.
Okay. What else changes long term?
Another really interesting, less discussed effect is on your body's stress system. The HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Right. That controls cortisol, adrenaline.
Yeah.
The stress response.
Precisely. And here's the kicker. Regular drinking, even those chronic low to moderate patterns we just talked about, it changes this axis.
Ow.
The result is your body releases more cortisol, the main stress hormone at your baseline, when you are not drinking.
Wait, so even though alcohol might feel relaxing while you're drinking in between drinks, or if you stop, you actually feel more stressed and anxious baseline.
That's what the science indicates, yes.
Yeah.
Your underlying physiological stress level is higher.
That's huge, because people often drink to de-stress.
Exactly. It's a bit of a trap. And this insight is really important if you're thinking about cutting back or quitting, because feeling more anxious when you reduce or stop, that's actually a normal, expected physiological thing happening. Your baseline cortisol is up, and it takes time to come back down.
So it's not just psychological withdrawal, it's physiological.
It's definitely physiological, and knowing that maybe suggests that finding other ways to manage stress during that period could be really helpful.
Good point. Okay, let's pivot slightly. What about risk factors? Genetics, age?
Right. So the science is clear. There isn't one single gene for alcoholism. It's much more complex.
Okay.
It seems to be clusters of genes related to different brain pathways, serotonin, GABA, that HPA stress axis we just mentioned, combined with your environment. That whole mix contributes to the risk of developing alcohol use disorder, or AUD.
Are there specific genes people might know about?
Well, there are variations in the gene for an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. That's key for breaking down alcohol.
Ah, right.
Some people have versions that make this enzyme work very slowly, so even a little alcohol makes them feel sick, flushed.
Which probably makes them less likely to drink much.
Exactly. It's protective in a way. Others have versions where the enzyme is super active. They can process alcohol faster, maybe drink more, without feeling ill effects initially.
Which increases their total exposure and potential risk down the line.
Precisely.
Can you, spot a predisposition? Are there signs?
Well, it's not definitive, of course, but the science suggests people who tend to feel really energized by alcohol, who can drink quite a lot and keep going maybe the life of the party type.
Uh-huh.
Especially if they had blackouts. They might have genetic factors or established patterns putting them at higher risk. It's something to be aware of.
Okay. But genes aren't the whole picture. You said environment matters too.
Hugely. And one environmental factor stands out as incredibly important and maybe surprising.
No.
The age you start drinking.
How so?
The science is stark here. Starting drinking young, like 13 or younger, or even 14 or 15, significantly increases the risk of developing AUD later on.
Really? Regardless of family history?
Regardless of family history, that early exposure seems to be a powerful, independent risk factor.
Wow. Compared to starting later.
Yeah, contrast that with someone who has their first drink at or after the legal age, say 21 in the US. The science suggests their probability of developing full-blown AUD is actually very low, even if they have some genetic predisposition.
So it's really not nature or nurture, it's both.
Absolutely. Genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger, as they say, and early exposure seems to be a major environmental trigger.
Okay, let's shift gears again. You mentioned the gut-liver-brain axis. What is that and how does alcohol affect it?
Right, so this axis is basically the constant two-way communication highway between your digestive system, your gut, your liver, and your brain. They talk via nerves, like the big vagus nerve, and also through chemical signals.
Okay, a communication network. And alcohol messes with it.
Big time. Starting in the gut. Alcohol, remember, is an antiseptic. It kills bacteria.
Right.
So when you drink it, it kills bacteria in your gut pretty indiscriminately, including the good guys, your beneficial gut microbiota, which are vital for health.
Okay, so disrupting the good bacteria.
Yes. And at the same time, your liver is working overtime metabolizing the alcohol. We mentioned this is tough on the liver cells, but the process itself is also pro-inflammatory.
Meaning?
Meaning it releases these inflammatory signal molecules called cytokines, things like IL-6, TNF-alpha, into your system.
Okay, so inflammation signals from the liver. What else in the gut?
Well, alcohol also damages the lining of your gut. It can make it more permeable, leading to what people often call leaky gut.
Leaky gut, meaning things get through that shouldn't.
Exactly. Nasty stuff, like components of bad bacteria from food that hasn't been fully digested can leak out of the gut and into your bloodstream.
Okay, so you've got bad stuff leaking from the gut and inflammatory signals coming from the liver.
Yes, so this problematic combo hits the bloodstream, and these signals then travel up to the brain. It's called neuroimmune signaling, the nervous system and immune system talking to the brain.
And what happens when those signals reach the brain?
This is where it gets really nasty. This signaling from the damaged gut-liver system back to the brain actually disrupts the brain circuits that normally control your desire for alcohol and how much you drink.
It disrupts them how?
It seems to create a reinforced craving to drink even more.
A vicious cycle.
Totally. You drink, it damages the gut and liver, which sends signals to the brain making you want to drink more, which causes more damage. The source calls it a terrible scenario.
Wow. Okay, that sounds bad. Is there anything that can help break that cycle? Support repair?
Well, the science does suggest focusing on the gut might help. Specifically, replenishing this beneficial gut bacteria could be a key part of repairing this whole axis.
How do you do that? Probiotics.
That's one avenue, but the source also highlights research on fermented foods.
Like yogurt, kimchi.
Exactly. Studies show that regularly eating, say, 2 to 4 servings a day of low-sugar fermented foods, things like kimchi, sauerkraut, natto, low-sugar kefir, or yogurt, can actually reduce inflammatory markers in the body and improve the health and diversity of your gut microbiome.
Interesting. So eating sauerkraut could potentially help with the fallout from drinking.
Well, it hasn't been studied specifically as a treatment for AUD, but the underlying science suggests that supporting your gut health, whether through fermented foods, maybe probiotics or prebiotics, it could be a really valuable tool for general health and potentially supporting recovery if you are cutting back or stopping drinking.
Makes sense. Okay, let's tackle the beast. The hangover.
Well,
Something most drinkers know well.
yes, the hangover. The science describes it not as one single symptom, but a constellation of effects. Headache, nausea, brain fog.
And that awful anxiety feeling.
Anxiety.
Anxiety.
Anxiety is a real thing, and it connects directly back to what we talked about with the HPA axis and stress.
The increased baseline cortisol.
Exactly. That elevated stress level caused by the alcohol's lingering effects on your system is a big part of why you feel so anxious and on edge during a hangover. Knowing that connection can actually be helpful, maybe make it feel less random.
Okay, so anxiety is linked to cortisol. What else contributes to feeling awful?
Poor sleep is a huge one. The science is crystal clear. Even just one drink messes with your sleep quality.
How so?
It disrupts the architecture, less deep slow-wave sleep, less REM sleep. You might feel like you slept, but it wasn't restorative. It's sometimes called pseudo-sleep.
Pseudo-sleep, right.
Yeah.
That explains the brain fog.
It definitely contributes. And then there's the gut disruption we just discussed.
Yeah.
That general feeling of malaise, nausea. A lot of that is likely gut-related too, so supporting your gut might even help with hangover symptoms.
Okay. And dehydration. People always say drink water.
Yes, dehydration and electrolyte imbalance are key. Alcohol as a diuretic makes you pee more.
Right.
But you're not just losing water, you're losing vital electrolytes, sodium, potassium, magnesium, which your nerves and muscles need to function properly. Alcohol also messes with vasopressin, the hormone that helps your body balance water levels.
And the headache. That pounding headache.
Often a rebound effect. Alcohol initially widens blood vessels. As it wears off, they constrict, sometimes overconstrict, and that can trigger pain.
So people take painkillers like ibuprofen or aspirin.
They do, and it can help the headache. But the science adds a caution. Think about your liver, which might still be processing alcohol or already under strain. And some NSAIDs can also be tough on the gut or affect the immune system. So maybe use with caution.
Got it. Okay, so what actually works for a hangover? Let's bust some myths. Eating. Does eating help?
Eating before you drink or while you're drinking, yes, that slows down alcohol absorption, gives your body more time to process it.
Okay. But eating a big, greasy breakfast after you're already hungover?
That won't magically sober you up or clear the alcohol faster. It might settle your stomach a bit or maybe blunt the effects if you were, say, planning to drink more right then, which leads us to
The hair of the dog. Drinking more alcohol to cure the hangover.
the classic. The science basically calls this a terrible idea.
Why? Doesn't it work temporarily?
It might temporarily ease symptoms, yeah, maybe by redilating those constricted blood vessels, but you're just delaying the inevitable and likely making the eventual hangover even worse. Plus, you're putting more alcohol into a system that's already stressed.
Right. Bad plan. What about a cold shower? Or jumping in cold water?
Okay, this one needs a huge safety warning. There's some very limited evidence that a spike in adrenaline might slightly speed up alcohol clearance.
But
UT, and this is critical, do not expose yourself to cold water, showers, or especially immersion while you are still drunk.
why not?
Because alcohol messes with your body's temperature regulation. It lowers your core temperature. Combining that with cold exposure is incredibly dangerous. Risk of hypothermia is very real, not to mention slipping or drowning. Just don't do it while intoxicated.
Okay, very clear. Safety first. What about cold exposure for recovery, like the next day?
That's different. If done safely, after the alcohol is mostly cleared, deliberate cold exposure, like a cold shower or dip for 1-3 minutes or more, can cause a big spike in adrenaline and also a longer-lasting release of dopamine.
Dopamine, the feel-good chemical.
Right. So potentially, the adrenaline could help slightly with clearing any remaining metabolites, and the dopamine could definitely improve mood and counter some of that foggy feeling. But look into safe ways to do it if you're interested.
Good tip. What is scientifically solid for helping recovery?
Electrolytes. Replenishing those lost electrolytes is really important.
Because of the diuretic effect.
Exactly. Using electrolyte drinks or supplements before, during, or after drinking can definitely help restore that balance your nerves need.
Okay, electrolytes. Now, here's something fascinating from the science.
Right.
Different drinks cause worse hangovers.
Yes. This is really interesting data. There's a general ranking. Darker liquors often seem worse. Brandy tends to be near the top for hangover severity.
Worse than, say, vodka.
Generally, yes. Brandy, red wine, rum, whiskey, white wine, gin, vodka. And then, interestingly, pure ethanol mixed with orange juice tends to cause the least severe hangover in these comparisons.
Wait, ethanol in OJ has lots of sugar, doesn't it? I thought sugar made hangovers worse.
That's the surprising part. It suggests it's not primarily sugar. The key factor seems to be congeners.
Congeners.
What are those? They're basically other chemical compounds produced during fermentation and aging, besides ethanol itself. They give different drinks their characteristic flavors, aromas, and colors.
And those are the culprits for worse hangovers.
They seem to correlate strongly with hangover severity. And linking back to our earlier discussion...
Let me guess. The gut.
Bingo! The science suggests a major way congeners worsen hangovers is by further disrupting your gut microbiome.
Yeah. It all comes back to the gut again.
It often does.
Yeah.
So the takeaway on hangovers, no single magic bullet. It's a multi-system assault. You need to address hydration, electrolytes, sleep debt, gut health, maybe safe cold exposure. And of course, the science is clear. The best way to avoid one is simply not to drink.
Makes sense. Okay, final stretch. Let's talk tolerance and the bigger picture of long-term health impacts. What is tolerance, scientifically?
Tolerance is basically needing more alcohol over time to get the same effect you used to get with less.
Why does that happen?
Primarily, it's changes in your brain's neurotransmitter systems. They're trying to adapt to being repeatedly exposed to alcohol and that toxic acetaldehyde.
How do they adapt?
Remember the pattern we discussed? Alcohol gives a relatively short feel-good spike, dopamine, serotonin maybe, followed by a much longer feel-bad period as the brain tries to compensate.
Yeah.
Well, the core of tolerance is that with repeated drinking, that initial feel-good spike gets smaller and shorter, while the feel-bad aftermath gets longer and more intense.
You drink more.
To chase that shrinking positive feeling, but you mainly just end up with more of the negative effects. Your liver might get a bit faster at clearing alcohol, that's metabolic tolerance, but it doesn't fix the brain changes, the diminishing reward, or the worsening aftermath.
That sounds like a downward spiral.
It can definitely become one.
Okay, beyond tolerance, what are the documented, hard-hitting health impacts? Brain health.
Yes, we touched on this, but it bears repeating. Large studies, like the huge UK Biobank study, show pretty clearly that even low to moderate regular drinking, defined in that study as like 7 to 14 drinks a week.
Which many people might consider normal.
Right. Even that level is associated with reductions in brain thickness, both gray matter, the neurons, and white matter, the connections.
And more alcohol means?
More thinning. It scales with consumption. The data really suggests that for optimal brain health, zero alcohol is likely best.
Okay, and cancer risk.
Yeah.
That's often mentioned.
Yes. The science shows alcohol can alter DNA methylation and gene expression, basically, how your genes are switched on or off. This can increase the risk of cancers developing.
Are certain cancers more strongly linked?
The link to breast cancer in women is particularly highlighted in the material we looked at. Breast tissue seems especially vulnerable to alcohol's damaging effects on cells.
And is that risk quantified?
Yes, and this is a sobering statistic. The science suggests a potential 4% to 13% increase in breast cancer risk for every 10 grams of alcohol consumed regularly per day.
Okay, how much is 10 grams of alcohol?
Roughly, it's about one standard U.S. drink, like a 12-ounce beer, a 5-ounce glass of wine, or a 1.5-ounce shot of spirits. Though, exact amounts vary.
So even one drink a day potentially carries that increased risk for breast cancer.
That's the implication from the data reviewed, linked to how alcohol disrupts normal cell cycles and can lead to mutations.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a lot of ground today, a real deep dive into the science.
We really have, from ethanol's basic toxicity and how it gets everywhere.
Right, to how it messes with your brain circuits, immediately causing that drunk feeling, blackouts.
Yes. And then those surprising long-term changes. Making you more impulsive, raising your baseline stress levels, even when sober.
Plus the whole gut-liver-brain axis mess, that negative feedback loop.
Yep. And dissecting the hangover, the anxiety, the sleep disruption, electrolytes, congeners.
And finally, those documented impacts on brain volume.
Yeah.
And that very specific quantified cancer risk increase.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And, our goal throughout this, as always, was just to lay out the science that we found in the source material.
Exactly. Not to preach, not to judge.
But hopefully to give you, the listener, a clearer picture based on the evidence, so you're better equipped to make your own informed decisions about alcohol, whatever they may be.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Considering how the science shows these impacts go way beyond just the temporary buzz, affecting our stress, our brain wiring, our future health risks, even when we're not feeling any effect from alcohol. It really does make you pause and wonder, doesn't it? What's the true full cost of that drink, and what might we gain by really understanding these hidden impacts?